always been very interested in children's literature, how it grows and moves, how it shapes people, how it shapes childhood. A story to a child isn't the same as it is to an adult. A children's book isn't just for recreation or entertainment. In many ways it's both, but in many ways children's literature is how society creates the ideal childhood. To an effect, children's literature is what produces the ideal child. Every story, every character, they all guide the reader. They all have a message. What is right? What is wrong? Not only does the story have a lesson for the child reading it, but it has a lesson for the adult who read it as a child. The fairy tales of our childhood, the adventure books from our youth, each leaves behind an idea on what childhood is about, what childhood is for, and how a child should behave. Consider some of the books that you read as a child, whether it was C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, perhaps Harry Potter. Even the obscure books like Awakened Dreaming, they all leave something behind. In Awakened Dreaming, it's Theo's idea of the ideal family, the notion that she should have this perfect family like the Caldors that she idolizes. The book itself sets the precedent, as well as represents the reality that we live in, and how we strive towards that. In essence, Awakened Dreaming sets the bar for what we should expect for ourselves, and what we should expect of children. This isn't a new idea either. Early folktales as early as 200 AD, such as the Panchantra from India, have long since had guidance and lessons for children, and because of their widespread acceptance, they have always been a standard for which children were held to, and through which adults expected to treat their children. So when we consider modern literature, it's obvious that just like in the past, what is being written can be internalized.
It gives you input, and even just reading those things, that gives you influence for anything. Say if you're a movie creator, you used to read these kind of things as a kid, you would have gotten the inspiration for your fantasy, action, or whatever film you're making. Any kind of creative output, it's going to come from what you took from your experiences as a kid, whether them being in real life or in a novel. And I find that like a children's novel is, I guess, the first step in that direction of building your own creative mind. Children's books should definitely be written for children. The fact that there's a certain content that's, I guess, appropriate for children. Like, you're not going to put an intense amount of gore or something that would scar a child for, like, the rest of their life in a children's book. Like, that's why it's for children. So yes, they should definitely be written for children, and be written with the intention of, I guess, expanding their mind and their understanding. Also encouraging them to have open minds in the sense of being able to accept new possibilities and new experiences.
Child should be able to, as part of their growing up, being able to make their own decisions on what they feel is responsible for them to read and them to learn and take influence from. That's part of their own personal decisions and development. So while I believe that it's circumstantial, but as an overall statement, I'd say a parent should take part of what a child should be reading and not necessarily just flat out censor it.
In order for a child to be so wrapped up in a fictional personality, they need to have the predisposition to be that way. Sometimes you'll hear of adults criticizing video games for being too violent, or criticizing movies or TV shows or commercials for being too violent and being a poor role model for children. However, a child will seek out their own role models based on their own personalities that they had already. If a child already has the inclination to be violent, they're going to read violent literature. Or they're going to seek out violence within literature that wouldn't normally be perceived as violent. If you look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's a very classic novel intended for readers as young as 9 years old, maybe younger depending on the maturity. But there are some very violent scenes in it. a child can choose to take after the White Witch's personality and be evil, or a child can choose to be more like one of the children in the story and overcome the temptation to be evil in order to do something good.
Of course, it isn't so simple. Not just anybody can write something and see it be adopted into society. The adult population are very much the gatekeepers of content, because it is with their dollars that they cast a vote. This deserves to exist, this does not. In effect, they pay for what they want to exist. Because of this, liked materials propagate. Disliked materials fall by the wayside. Thus, the stories that make it into the hands of children make it to them because people want them to. Because after all the votes were tallied, and the dollars laid on the table, those were the stories that adults deemed appropriate. So then, are those stories likely to be a radical departure from typical children's content? Or are they more likely to be very much the same, and reinforce what people already expect of children, and of childhood? Consider every Disney movie you've seen in the past decade. Not much diversity, is there? That's not to say there isn't any. However, the change is very gradual, as are the changes within society, and in literature. Things don't just move along for their own sake. It's always a constant refinement of pre-existing ideas.
When I was little, like, The Lion King came out, and, like, that movie was, like, the bomb. And it made so much money, too, right? So they're just like, hey, you know what? Talking animals, that works. We'll go and we'll do that a few more times. And the whole Disney princess thing, it sells. So it has changed slightly. Like, if you look at, like, Cinderella or, like, Sleeping Beauty and Frozen, like, two totally different time zones, right? So they are different, but they're still, like, the same, like, princess meets prince falls in love. I think that the characters have basically stayed the same because, again, they can see that kids can connect with it, even if it's not necessarily the best kind of connecting. And again, it sells. So if they like it and they can connect with the characters, then they'll watch it again and they'll like it, and then, again, more money.
It's not actually defined by children. It is defined by adults. Adults decide what children read. It's actually very complex because every child is different and every parent raises their child differently. I think books should be specifically written for children in the same way that I believe that books should be specifically written for adults. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think that all children's literature should have some sort of big lesson involved. That doesn't mean that I believe that children's literature should be censored. And that doesn't mean that children's literature should be untrue and that we should hide reality from children.
It does seem like society has a certain knack for hiding things from children. Consider any of the near immeasurable amounts of deaths that happen in children's film, where right before the audience would be viewing a corpse, the camera all of a sudden almost too strategically moves to hide it. Same with children's books. Wrath the Tagarung is told to have perished in the battle, out of sight of the reader. Professor Quirrell dies sometime after Harry passes out. Whether intentional or not, the bulk of children's literature panders to the notion that children simply cannot handle certain topics. This is why most works center on some idealized version of childhood, as if a kid just being a kid is sacred, or that childhood is some kind of fertile, sterile fantasy land where death is handled by fading to black. But this modern perception of childhood and children's content has not always been the same. Just 100 years ago, two brothers, Wilhelm and Jacob, immortalized a massive array of stories where death and suffering are inherent, and punishment in a gruesome way is inevitable. The duo were so successful that the common tongue still remembers their grim writings. So then, where did this common ceremony around the modern child originate? It came from us, from society, through the buying of books, through the writing of children's authors, and through the stories we tell. But then, how does it ever change? Well, While most readers and authors are quite content to travel the beaten trail, there are those who do things a little different. Case in point, Half-World, a sick and grotesque tale of a child conceived in purgatory and its mother's journey out of the never-relenting void of indecency that is the half-world. Objectionable, offensive, very different, to say the least, and yet intended for children. Half-World is very much an experimental kind of work, and while it may have ruffled some feathers upon its release, it, and 1,000 more books like it, are ever awaiting their chance with readers. And while not every one will be a home run, Half-World selling just a paltry 80,000 copies, some are, and the audiences who read them, well,
I'd say that in some senses, the books that children read will influence how the child acts in a behavior. Like, a person who reads like stuff like Goosebumps or might jump into like Stephen King at an even younger age, might have that kind of I guess I'd say offset in their mind, in a sense that they'd be more open to the dark and disturbed. I'm not saying it's going to make them a dark and disturbed, like it's not going to make them crazy. I'm saying that they're going to have a different artistic look when it comes to things that are dark and well, scary to some people, but to them it might be completely normal.
So being able to have a language that they understand and be able to comprehend while still being able to make it, applicable in real life would be probably the most beneficial for them. Reading at a younger age, and you'll probably be more literate when you grow up. So it only seems like it could help.
I definitely think having a young kid, because my sister's 6, I definitely think without just the books that she has, she wouldn't, she knows how to read Spanish, she knows how to, write her own stories, she's very imaginative, all this kind of stuff is coming because, books that we can choose from, online bookstores, a lot of them are covering, more adult topics now, instead of, babying them. So, when I was a kid, it would be if you wanted to talk about a serious topic, but, have a book that's able for kids to understand, it would be more my pet died and I'm sad and this is how to deal with it. But now there's books my dad went to jail and it's wow. So I think it's really interesting that there's not this whole they're young, they should be sheltered thing anymore, and the best way to do it is through books because kids are reading all the time and we're trying to get them into reading, and with that then it's a great opportunity to touch on topics and get them being more creative and get them imaginative, because it's kind of a difficult process nowadays with so much technology and video games.
And a process it is. In fact, one could even say that children's literature is, in and of itself, a process. Sure, the individual works have endings, but even as a new book rolls off the line, a new one is being prepared to take its place, and with a new story comes a new opportunity for learning, for entertainment, and of course, a new idea of what it means to have a happy childhood and what it is to be a good child. Maybe it'll change the world and forever become the glorious standard by which all future generations aspire to. Or maybe it'll gather dust.
Percy Jackson, the original 5, and then continue reading into Lost Hero.
Goosebumps by R.L. Stine, that was one of the big things.
Fucking Ron Kenshin.
Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling.
The Man Jumped Over the Moon. That was
Once Upon a Marigold!